This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Brought to you by the Capital One Quicksilver Card. With Quicksilver, you earn unlimited 1.5% cash back on every purchase everywhere. That's unlimited 1.5% cash back on everything you buy. And unlimited really means unlimited. With Quicksilver, there's no limit to how much cash back you can earn. Capital One. What's in your wallet? Credit approval required. Capital One Bank, USA, N.A.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Tina Dahealy. You're listening to Beyond Today from BBC Radio 4, the space to ask one big question about one big story. Today we're asking, did one Russian mastermind all this political chaos? The world feels completely confusing at the moment. Brexit, Trump, the rise of populism and far-right and far-left movements. And there's one country that keeps getting a mention: Russia. And this idea that Russia is somehow responsible and meddling with everything. Over the weekend, Donald Trump ended up being cleared of conspiring with Russia during the 2016 US election. But the BBC correspondent Gabriel Gatehouse came to us on Beyond Today to tell us passionately that if we think that's the end of it, then we've completely missed the point.
Чужеземные политики приписывают России вмешательство в выборы и в референдум. Foreign politicians ascribe to Russia the meddling in elections and referendums around the world. In fact, things are much more serious than that. Russia is meddling in their brains, and they've got no idea what to do about it.
He's reading the words of one extremely powerful man that he's been trying to track down. He's arguably the puppet master of the entire chaos of the global political system, but you've probably never heard of him.
His name is Vladislav Surkov, but each time you try to reach for him, he slips out of your grasp. This is what I've spent the past few months doing, and it's both fascinating and frustrating and eventually tells you something about the world, but it takes you quite a long time to get there. The reason people who know about Russia know about him is because basically in the noughties, he basically ran Russian internal politics. He was the power behind the throne. They called him Putin's Rasputin. And he was a PR man. That's where he came from. And he played with that. He spent most of his time, he spent half of his time trying to make Putin's system work for him. It was like a sort of, he called it sovereign democracy, but it was actually fake democracy, really. It had all the sort of trappings of democracy, elections, a parliament, a free-ish press, that kind of stuff. But actually, any vote only ever had one outcome: Putin. Whatever you say, whatever you do, Putin. Whatever you do, Putin. Whatever you want to write in the news, Putin. Putin, Putin, Putin.
How did he go from being a PR guy, didn't know PR existed in Russia in the Western sense, to becoming the man responsible for creating Putinism?
His dad was Chechen, his mum was Russian. His dad disappeared when he was young, and so he's brought up in this small provincial Russian town, about a 5-hour drive southeast of Moscow. His mum's a provincial school teacher. It's like a sort of Chekhovian existence of boredom when nothing ever happens in this town. It's called Skopin and there's nothing there. And basically, as soon as he can, he gets out and he moves to the big city. And it's Moscow, it's perestroika, it's glasnost, and there's this kind of crazy feeling that anything is possible. And what he does is he goes off and he studies a course in theatre directing. This is where the legend starts. You don't know what's mythology, you don't know what's true, you don't know what's half true. And actually, I should caveat everything I say here by I will let you know. I'll ring a big bell if I know that something is definitely true. Have we got some kind of a bell? I could take this thing.
We've got a pet biro and a paper cup.
I don't know what I could do, but I could tap this bottle. Right, here we go.
That's better. Okay.
This is your 100% truthometer. Right? Okay. If we whack that, we know where.
Is he a real person?
Yes.
Okay, continue.
Okay, so I'm not whacking the bottle now, right? So he studies a course in theatre directing. He gets expelled for fighting. Right? This is all part of the mythology. And then he meets a guy called Mikhail Khodorkovsky. That's true.
That's a high-pitched one.
Yeah, he meets Khodorkovsky. Khodorkovsky is famous now. He lives partly in London. He's in exile. He's Putin's biggest critic. He spent 10 years in a gulag for opposing Putin. But he was Surkov's kind of route into PR and then politics. So he meets this guy. He's a young businessman. It's still the Soviet Union. It's the dying days of the Soviet Union. And the story goes, no bell here, no bottle, but the story goes that Khodorkovsky hired him as a bodyguard. He was studying karate with a karate master. I don't know if any of this is true.
Why is there always like a martial art?
I know judo, right?
These
karate.
people, Putin and judo.
I don't know. Anyway, so this oligarch hires him as a bodyguard. The businessman hires a bodyguard. The bodyguard is Surkov, and very quickly the businessman realizes that Surkov's brains are much more useful to him than his brawn. He's a super clever guy. He's demonically clever. And this is one of the things, there are two things that everyone I've spoken to say about him, whether they're friends or foes. He's super, super, super clever, and he's super, super, super loyal. He always knows who his boss is, and he's loyal to the boss. Those are the two things.
That deserves a ting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. The truth ting. Okay, so the oligarch is like, oh, this bodyguard is much too clever to be a bodyguard. I'm going to put him in charge of PR. And he does this one thing, that the story that everyone tells. And when I retell it, you might just go, okay. But anyway, Russians love it. So the main program on Soviet state TV, news program, 9 o'clock, was called Vremya, Time. And it basically was the one program you watched. Obviously, one thing that was forbidden was adverts, right? It's the Soviet Union. It's, you don't do commercials. And one day, everyone's sitting down, they're watching the program. The music's just starting, and suddenly they see a logo of the oligarch's company, and it's an advert on state TV, and everyone's like, what? And that is the one story that everyone tells about Surkov, about how brilliant he was.
They saw an ad on TV.
They saw an ad on TV, but they'd never seen ads on TV. This was groundbreaking, right? So he just took something from the West and he learned how it worked really quickly, and then he introduced it into Russia. And this is what he's done over and over again. And this is basically the basis.
When are we talking about now?
So this was 1988, 89, something like that. Like the 89, I think it was. The Soviet Union is still in existence, basically. The Soviet Union still has 2 years to go. Anyway, so he ends up as this PR guy for the oligarch. He basically writes the rules for Russian PR. And we're talking about the kind of early to mid-90s. These were crazy times in Russia, right? They'd sort of thrown everything out the window, right? Communism was out. Capitalism was in, and a handful of people got super, super, super rich.
The oligarchs, as we now know them.
The oligarchs, right? These people got rich. They also got killed, right? There were rivals were gunned down in the street. You could make a fortune overnight. You could be dead the next day. And it was this kind of intersection of business and politics where you couldn't really tell what was business and what was politics. And that's where Surkov thrived. And he basically studied Western capitalism, he studied Western PR, and he studied Western democratic institutions, and he gobbled it all up. And he goes, right, I get this. And then when Putin comes along, he helps Putin get elected. And he takes those three ingredients, those three Western ingredients, he shakes them all up, and he turns it into Putinism, which is this crazy twisted system that we see today.
He's the man responsible for Putinism. How did he do it, and what did he do?
So, first of all, he took control of the media, so especially TV. So he had journalists who would do what he said, his office in the Kremlin. He had telephones. He could call all the editors, as well as having a hotline to the president. He had a hotline to all the editors, pick up his phone, tell them what to say, what not to say. Then he set up a pro-Putin party. So you can see that the kind of the Western model here, right? So we've got a president. We need a party that supports him, right? So it's like Democrats and Republicans. So he creates this party, but he controls all the MPs. So he famously once said to one MP who was not doing what he was told, he said, "You either do what you're told, or you end up like Khodorkovsky, his old boss, the oligarch, who ended up in a gulag." So basically, yes, we've got a parliament, but it's not for doing what we think parliaments are for doing. I mean, we see, the Putin's party, United Russia, is there to rubber stamp Kremlin decisions. So it's
to give the appearance of a democracy.
Exactly, the appearance of democracy, but not really. So anyway, so he creates the pro-Putin party. He then makes sure he controls all the MPs. But then, of course, in a democracy, you need an opposition. So he makes sure that he controls all the opposition as well. He looks at what happens in Ukraine in 2004 and 2005 and Georgia the year before.
What happened there?
They were called the colour revolutions. People came out on the streets and they basically overthrew the old regimes that they saw as corrupt, loyal to Moscow, in fact. It was people power. They went out on the streets, they demonstrated. There were rock musicians, all the cool people were on the streets, basically, and the non-cool people were in the political offices, and they overthrew their government. Surkov saw this, and he was like, "Oh, we don't want that here." So he creates his own youth movements that, attack is the best form of defense. Let's occupy the streets, right? And so he gets in there early. He looks at the counterculture and he goes, "I'm going to build a counterculture." He's working that fast. He's one step ahead of you all the time. And with the rock musicians, apparently he called a meeting. I'm not going to give this I'm going to give this a tiny little small truthometer, because I think it is true, but
might not be.
I've only got one source, but it's a good source. He calls a meeting of all the most famous Russian rock musicians in 2005. This is right after Ukraine's first people power revolution. And he goes, "Right, guys, you saw what happened in Ukraine. We don't want that to happen here. Now, I'm not asking you to support Putin. That's just not very cool. We don't need that. I just ask you not to support the opposition and don't go out onto the streets. And if you need any money, come to me."
Super smart.
Super smart. And it works, right? The regime in Russia is pretty solid. You're not going to get rid of it anytime soon. It felt like Surkov was running everything. Nothing happened without his say-so. Nothing happened by chance. Nothing could ever be spontaneous. Surkov was pulling the strings. Now, of course, this wasn't actually true. But this was the myth that he created. And to me, it feels really similar to some of the narratives around Russian interference in the West today. Like there are some people who genuinely feel like everything that happens, Brexit, Trump, the far right, the far left, Corbyn, everything is Russia, and they're pulling the strings. How could it ever be spontaneous? Of course, this isn't true. But of course, they love the fact that we think it is true. That's a win for them.
What's happened to him now?
Having basically become, at least in the minds of Russians, the second most powerful man in the country, who controlled everything. The pro-Kremlin youth groups, the MPs, the opposition youth groups, the culture, everything. He can't keep all of these balls up in the air at the same time. In 2011, Russia was coming up to a crucial election. What had happened was that Putin had to step back from the presidency in 2008 because the constitution barred him from running for a third consecutive term. So he and his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev, did this little swapperoo. They switched round. So Putin became prime minister, which is subservient to the president. Dmitry Medvedev was his president, but really Putin was still the most powerful person. And then we were coming up to this next election. And the big question was Putin going to come back to the presidency, or was Medvedev going to stay there? And Russian society kind of divided into two camps. The liberals wanted Medvedev to stay, and the hardliners wanted Putin back. And when they decided amongst themselves that Putin was going to come back, the liberals were furious. And there were these huge street protests in Moscow, like tens and tens of thousands of people out on the streets. They were the biggest protests since the fall of the Soviet Union. And they were thinking, oh, shit. Yes, that's what they were thinking. Are we allowed to say that?
Yes.
Excellent.
Definitely allowed to say that.
Oh, shit, they were thinking. But thank God, we've got Surkov. He controls everything. That's all right. So he's got the youth groups and the opposition. He can just but it turned out it was too much for him. He crashed and burned, and he got blamed for these protests. And so Putin fired him. He was out.
Harsh.
I know, right? Although
he made Putin.
I know he made Putin, right? Although his sacking was simultaneously a promotion. He got promoted to Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, whereas before he'd been Deputy Head of the Presidential Administration. So, in a kind of weird way, it was also a promotion, but it was a position with no power. So he was kind of out, and then a year later he was sacked for real. And that was it, basically. We thought, he's gone. End of the Surkov era. He disappeared. I reconnected with him in quite an extraordinary way. I was in Kiev in February 2014. Street protests, again. The Ukrainians were in the middle of trying to overthrow their regime, a pro-Russian president. They wanted to integrate with Europe. They were all out there on the streets. And then one day, it suddenly turns violent. The riot police start shooting at the protesters who've been there for months. Blood in the streets. 75 people are dead. It's chaotic, but you can kind of see what's going on, because you've got the riot police up there who've got guns. You've got the protesters down here who don't, most of them, baseball bats.
You were in amongst it all.
Yeah. So you can see what's going on. There's shooting going on between there, but it's all at street level. And then suddenly, we were sort of just off to one side, so that we could see both sides, really, and trying to keep safe out of the direct line of fire. And suddenly, up on the 18th floor of this hotel we were staying in fact, I saw a curtain twitch, and something caught my eye. It was just a flash of light or something, and I thought, what is that? What? That window, facing directly to us. Yeah. Fuck! Okay, get the fuck out of here. They were shooting at us, and then the riot police disappeared. And it was all very odd. We couldn't figure out who were these people who were shooting from up there. Why were they shooting apparently at both sides? It just didn't make, even in the chaotic kind of mess, it didn't make sense. Obviously, we didn't have that much time to kind of figure out what was going on. We ran and took cover. But in the months that followed, I tried to figure out what was going on. And then a year later, on the anniversary of that event, Ukraine's new president stepped up and said, we've done an investigation, and there were foreign snipers on the square that day, and they were directed by Vladislav Surkov. Down, down, down. I'm definitely not going to give this a
ting, ting, ting.
A ting, ting, ting. Yeah, it's because I think it's almost certainly not entirely true.
But hang on, hasn't he been sidelined by this?
Exactly. Point? He was out. He was down. He was gone. He'd been sidelined. Now, it turned out that he hadn't. So what's he doing now, you said? He's kind of running the war in Ukraine. He has an office in the Kremlin. His official job is something to do with unrecognized republics.
So he's back in with Putin?
He's now a small cog in a much bigger machine, because what Surkov is doing in Ukraine with these activists is very similar to what Russia is doing everywhere in Europe, and that's where these emails from Kremlin inboxes come in. You see them just connecting with small-scale activists or fringe politicians, inviting them over to Moscow to have chats, not necessarily giving them any money, but, giving them the warm treatment, making these kind of small-scale politicians feel important. They're invited to the Kremlin maybe, or to a big conference in St. Petersburg. And that way, they, in a scattergun way, they're trying to gain influence in Europe and in America.
Did you ever speak to or meet him in person?
So I tried very hard to try to meet him. I tried to intrigue him by quoting Russian literature at him. He loves Russian literature. As I said, he's written postmodernist novels.
Doesn't he love Tupac as well?
He loves Tupac. When he was in the Kremlin, he had a framed portrait of Tupac Shakur on his desk next to one of Putin.
Really?
Yeah. Just because, partly because he loves Tupac, but also partly because that's his style, right? He can recite Allen Ginsberg in English.
I walked on the banks of the tin can banana dock.
It's terrible.
And sit down under the huge shade of the Southern Pacific locomotive to look at the sunset.
But it's also quite funny.
And cry.
He's now under sanctions. He was sanctioned for his role in Crimea and Ukraine. And his reaction? So when they said, but you won't be able to go to America now anymore, Mr. Surkov, you're going to be cut off from all this stuff. And he's like, the only good things about America are Jackson Pollock and Tupac Shakur, and it's all in here. Taps his head.
What can we do then to counter it, to counter that narrative?
That's a very good question. And, I think the first thing to do is to recognise...
To laugh at it.
That, yeah, exactly. It's your reaction. It's like, don't be ridiculous. Because what Surkov did was he identified the weaknesses in the Western system, in Western democracy, capitalism, the power of PR, and he flipped it round. He turned it on us. But really, we're doing the work for him. It's all in our heads. He's in our heads because he understands how our system works. So how can we counter it? We need to sort our shit out. Blaming everything, all the chaos on the Russians is exactly what they want, because we will then not sort ourselves out. We need to sort ourselves out. That's what we need to do.
Solved. Thank you.
Anytime.
Thanks to Lucy Hancock and Jar Jar Mohammed. Thanks also to Gabriel Gatehouse, who's going to tell you why you should listen to his documentary in full on BBC Sounds.
You can do that because it's
brilliant.
It's fun. It's fun. I wouldn't usually say that, but I think it's brilliant.
Should also mention Nicola Rothfast mixed today's episode, and we'd love to know what you think. You can email us beyond.today@bbc.co.uk or use the hashtag BeyondToday. Thank you for listening.
You know the way late at night, in bed, in the dark, your tired mind can wander and strange thoughts float like balloons escaping into the sky. Well, Bunk Bed is a podcast where Peter Curran and Patrick Marber find the nearest faraway place from the hurly-burly of daily life, where tired minds can wander. Why don't you come along and eavesdrop and see if you like it? You can subscribe to Bunk Bed on BBC Sounds.